The bustling street market fell deathly silent the moment the CEO's hand sent the old man crashing into the pavement. It wasn't just the sound of the impact. It was the absolute shock, the disbelief, and the collective intake of breath from vendors, shoppers, and tourists who had never imagined that in a public square filled with life, something so cruel could happen in broad daylight. Old Han didn't cry. He didn't shout for help as he lay among the bloodstains and scattered noodles. He didn't even try to shield his face from the man towering over him with clenched fists. He simply looked up at him through his round glasses, steady, composed, and entirely unshaken. While Adrian Blackwell's authority filled the market street like toxic smoke, he truly believed he was finally teaching the nuisance a lesson. What he didn't know was that by touching the man on the ground, he had just signed his own death warrant. Within hours, his multi-billion-dollar empire would begin collapsing piece by piece. But before we expose the true identity of the man on the pavement, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who believes in justice, and subscribe for more powerful stories that reveal the truth, because this is one reveal you will never forget. The Metropolitan Business District stood as the crown jewel of the city's economic power. Glass skyscrapers, polished steel, and high-stakes boardrooms. It was a world where reputations were built on ruthlessness and protected at all costs. And at the absolute peak of this concrete jungle stood Adrian Blackwell. He was a man used to controlling everything he touched, tall, muscular, and wearing a navy suit that cost more than most people made in a year. He believed in discipline, in corporate hierarchy, and above all, in knowing your place. To him, the world was a ladder, and he was at the very top. And then there was Old Han, a 70-year-old vendor who had operated a simple blue food cart on the same corner for longer than Blackwell's company had existed. To the world outside, Adrian Blackwell was more than just a CEO. He was a force of nature who moved through the city with the calculated precision of a predator. As the head of Blackwell International, his influence stretched across the skyline, etched into the very steel and glass of the buildings he owned. He was a man who was admired by his peers, decorated by the industry, and deeply feared by his subordinates. In the high-stakes boardrooms of the Metropolitan Business District, Adrian was known for a reputation of perfection that left no room for error or dissent. His name alone carried a weight that could silence a room, a gravity that pulled everyone into his orbit whether they liked it or not. His employees had learned the hard way that Adrian believed in a world of absolute order. Junior executives whispered about his explosive temper behind closed doors, and secretaries learned to move with hurried silence whenever his polished black dress shoes clicked against the marble floors. Administrators and board members tolerated his suffocating arrogance because his results were, quite frankly, exceptional. He didn't just meet targets, he crushed them. Under his leadership, the company had become a relentless machine of profit, and Adrian was its undisputed architect. He operated on a personal philosophy rooted in discipline and a rigid hierarchy. To him, every person in the city had a specific place, and those who didn't fit into his vision of a modern, streamlined future were nothing more than obstacles to be cleared away. It was this obsession with perfection that drew his ire toward the bustling street market at the base of his headquarters. While others saw a vibrant community, Adrian saw chaos. He saw stained aprons, aging carts, and low-status individuals who dared to clutter the view from his top-floor office. He walked through the market not as a patron, but as a king inspecting a slum he intended to raise. His tall, muscular frame, draped in that signature dark navy luxury suit, stood in jarring contrast to the everyday people around him. He moved through the crowd with a dominating posture, his brow perpetually furrowed in a look of intense disdain for anything he deemed beneath him. He was a man used to controlling people with a single glance, a man who believed that wealth was synonymous with worth. As he stood at the edge of the market, eyes fixed on a certain blue noodle cart, he wasn't just looking at a vendor. He was looking at a problem he intended to solve with the same ruthlessness he used to take over companies. In the shadow of the soaring skyscrapers, tucked between the rush of corporate ambition and the grit of the city pavement, was the world of Old Han. To the thousands of office workers who blurred past him every morning, he was just a fixture of the landscape, as permanent and overlooked as the street lamps. He was a thin, frail man of 70, his white hair cropped short, and his face a map of gentle wrinkles that deepened when he smiled. He wore a worn-out beige shirt and a simple, stained apron that had seen years of honest labor. Behind his round glasses, however, were eyes that missed nothing, calm, precise, and reflecting a life of hidden depth. Han's blue food cart was far more than a poor man's stall. It was a masterclass in quiet excellence. While Blackwell's empire was built on aggressive expansion, Han's was built on the perfection of a single bowl of noodles. The cart was organized with surgical precision, every container of fresh ingredients placed exactly where it needed to be. He didn't boast about his skill, but the locals knew. They whispered about the clarity of his broth and the perfect texture of his noodles, qualities that spoke of a man who had mastered his craft decades ago. He worked with quiet confidence, listening more than he spoke, moving with a grace that defied his aged appearance. He lived a life of deliberate simplicity, blending into the rhythms of the market. To the world, he was a man struggling to make ends meet, a nobody in the hierarchy of the city. But those who took the time to look closer noticed that Han never seemed hurried or anxious. He accepted every coin with grace and treated every customer with the same steady respect, whether they were a homeless man or a wealthy intern. What no one in the bustling district suspected was that this humble routine was a choice. Han wasn't just another vendor trying to survive. He was a man who had already conquered the world and found it wanting. He had traded a throne for a noodle cart, choosing to watch over the city from the ground up, believing that true character is revealed not in the boardroom, but in how one treats a poor man on a crowded corner. The collision of two worlds finally occurred on a Tuesday morning, a day when the air felt thick with the impending heat of the city. Adrian Blackwell stepped out of the glass lobby of his headquarters, his tall, muscular frame cutting through the crowd like a blade. He didn't walk so much as he occupied space, his dark navy suit shimmering under the harsh sun as he made a direct line for the blue noodle cart. To Adrian, the sight of the steam rising from the vendors' pots was an affront to the sterile, high-tech aesthetic he had spent millions to curate. He stopped a few feet away, his polished black shoes resting on the uneven pavement, and looked down at old Han with a furrowed brow that signaled an immediate, controlled dominance. Adrian didn't ask for a menu. He simply pulled a sleek leather wallet from his pocket and extracted a thick envelope, heavy with the weight of cold, hard cash. He tossed it onto the cart's wooden counter, next to a bowl of fresh spring onions, as if he were discarding trash. He told the old man that it was more money than he would see in 5 years of selling noodles, and that in exchange, the cart had to be gone by sunset. He spoke of progress, of urban renewal, and of the discipline of the modern city, words that echoed the rigid hierarchy he believed in. Old Han didn't look at the envelope. He continued to wipe down a section of his counter with a steady, precise hand, his calm eyes never wavering. When he finally stopped, he straightened his frail frame and looked Blackwell directly in the eye through his round glasses. He didn't shout, and he didn't tremble. He simply stated, with a clarity that seemed to cut through the noise of the traffic, that his corner was not for sale. He spoke of roots, and of the people who relied on his stall, his voice reflecting a quiet confidence that Adrian was not prepared for. For a moment, the bustling market seemed to freeze. Adrian Blackwell's jaw tightened, a visible sign of the frustration simmering beneath his polished exterior. He was used to administrators who tolerated his arrogance and subordinates who moved quickly around his temper, but this poor vendor was looking at him as if his wealth carried no weight at all. The CEO's eyes narrowed, his teeth clenching as he realized that for the first time in years, he had been contradicted by someone he considered a nobody. He didn't take the money back. He simply leaned forward, his intimidating presence filling the space like smoke, and whispered that Han had just made a very expensive mistake. In the days that followed, the sun-drenched market square began to feel colder, as if Adrian Blackwell's reach had physically blocked out the light. Blackwell did not return to shout or make a scene. Instead, he initiated a campaign of controlled dominance that felt like a tightening noose. He used his vast corporate influence to weaponize the city's bureaucracy against a single blue noodle cart. Suddenly, health inspectors who had never before visited the market were appearing at Han's stall twice a day. their faces grim as they scrutinized every bowl and broth. Local police, feeling the pressure from Blackwell's high-level connections, began to hover near the cart, their presence an unspoken warning that the status quo had changed. Adrian watched the results from the floor-to-ceiling windows of his executive suite, his towering frame a silhouette of cold authority. He began watching Han through high-powered binoculars, much like he had once scrutinized the minor medication adjustments of those beneath him, looking for any flaw to exploit. Below, the staff of the surrounding office buildings, the very people who had once whispered admiration for Han's cooking, now learned to move quickly past the cart without making eye contact. They felt the shift in the air. To be seen at Han's stall was to invite the ire of the man who controlled their career paths and opportunities. Despite the growing shadow, old Han remained composed and unshaken. Even as his customer base dwindled, and the controlled dominance of the city's elite attempted to erase his presence, he continued his work with flawless precision. He never reacted emotionally to the inspector's interruptions or the officer's lingering stares. He simply adjusted his round glasses and served the few loyal patrons who still dared to visit with the same quiet confidence he had shown on day one. Blackwell's hostility was not loud, but it was pervasive, turning the vibrant street into a laboratory of psychological pressure. What Adrian Blackwell failed to realize, however, was that while he was busy correcting Han's tone and questioning his right to exist on that corner, he was merely poking a sleeping dragon. Han was not a man who could be moved by microaggressions or targeted hostility. He was merely observing the depth of Blackwell's rot. What no one in the bustling business district understood was that Han Jae-Min was not just a survivor of the city's streets. He was the architect of its shadows. Long before the glass towers of Blackwell International rose toward the clouds, Jae-Min had ruled the concrete below. He was the legendary king of the Underworld, a man whose name once commanded a silence more profound than any corporate boardroom. His influence had been absolute, a delicate balance of power that kept the city's darker impulses in check. But as the years passed, he had grown weary of the high-stakes games of dominance and the unspoken bias that came with absolute power. He had chosen to disappear into the mundane, trading his tailored suits for a dirty apron and his throne for a blue Noodle cart. When he stepped down into the semi-retirement, Jae-Min had established one unbreakable rule for his territory: no special treatment. He had forbidden his former associates from intervening in his new life, insisting that he be treated as nothing more than a simple vendor. He believed in merit and the quiet strength of an honest day's work, much like the daughter of a director who refused to use her father's name for leverage. He wanted to experience the city as its people did, to see if the equity and respect he had once enforced through fear could exist through simple human dignity. This meant that even as Adrian Blackwell's pressure mounted, Jae-Min's vast network remained dormant. His former lieutenants watched from the periphery, their eyes as sharp as security cameras, waiting for a signal that never came. They saw the controlled dominance Blackwell exerted, the way the CEO tried to shrink a legend to fit his own narrow vision of comfort. They knew that the poor man lying in wait was protected not by muscle, but by a code of integrity that Blackwell couldn't begin to comprehend. Jae-Min allowed the harassment to unfold because he believed that true justice doesn't require favoritism, it requires accountability. He was letting the CEO sign his own death warrant by proving, through his own actions, that he was unfit for the power he held. As Han wiped down his counter, his round glasses reflecting the towering skyscrapers, he wasn't just a victim of a bully. He was a judge observing a man who had long forgotten that silence sustains injustice, and he was preparing to break that silence in a way the city would never forget. The tension that had been simmering for weeks finally reached a boiling point on a morning that felt heavy with the scent of ozone and exhaust. The rhythmic sound of the market was suddenly drowned out by the low, guttural growl of heavy machinery. Adrian Blackwell had arrived, not with an envelope of cash this time, but with a yellow bulldozer that stood like a mechanical beast at the edge of the square. He stepped out of his sleek black sedan, his navy suit sharp against the dust of the street, looking like a man who had finally lost patience with the nuisance of the old world. He moved toward the blue Noodle cart with the same controlled dominance, He had used to terrorize his medical interns in another life, his presence filling the air like smoke. Blackwell didn't offer a greeting. He simply waved a thick stack of legal documents, an eviction and demolition order signed by the city's planning department. He spoke of progress, of the crown jewel luxury development that would soon replace the eyesore of the market, and of his absolute power to clear the path. He handed the papers to Old Han with a smirk, expecting the old man to finally crumble, to shout, or to plead for mercy. Instead, the square fell silent, much like the hospital hallway once had, as the collective intake of breath from the surrounding vendors and witnesses hung in the air. Old Han adjusted his round glasses and began to read. He didn't rush. His precise hands turned the pages with the calm confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for. Time seemed to slow down as Blackwell checked his watch, his jaw tightening with every passing second of perceived defiance. Then, Han stopped. He didn't look at the bulldozer or the crowd. He looked directly at Blackwell and pointed to a single line in the fine print. A subtle, critical error in the property boundaries and the zoning medication dosage adjustment that rendered the entire order invalid. The room, the street froze. Han had calmly pointed out a mistake that Blackwell's team of high-priced lawyers had missed, a minor detail that now threatened the procedure flow of the CEO's entire development project. Blackwell's face drained of color as he realized he had been contradicted again. His frustration, which had been simmering for weeks, began to boil over. He snatched the papers back, his teeth clenched and his brow furrowed in a mask of pure aggression. He didn't see the young woman recording the scene with her smartphone or the security officer shifting uneasily nearby. He only saw the old man who refused to know his place. The final warning had been issued, but it wasn't the vendor who was in danger. It was the CEO who had just ignored the fatal allergy catch in his own grand design. The air in the market square grew thin, vibrating with a tension that felt both ancient and immediate. Adrian Blackwell's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage as the quiet laughter of a few nearby vendors reached his ears, a sound he perceived as a direct assault on his dignity. He didn't see a human being standing before him. He saw a glitch in his perfect system, a piece of insubordination that needed to be crushed under the weight of his status. His teeth clenched, and his brow furrowed so deeply it seemed to shadow his eyes, turning them into dark pits of hostility. The explosion was sudden. Losing all sense of the controlled dominance he usually prided himself on, Blackwell lunged forward. With a guttural snarl of "Know your place," he delivered a violent, two-handed shove to the old man's chest. The impact was visceral. Old Han, frail and thin, was sent sprawling backward, his glasses skidding across the pavement as he crashed into the side of his own cart before hitting the ground. A sharp, humiliating silence followed, broken only by the sound of the vendor's body hitting the asphalt and the collective intake of breath from the crowd. But as Han lay there, blood beginning to stain his beige shirt, he didn't scream or plead for mercy. He remained composed, his eyes partially closed but steady, looking up at the CEO with a gaze that felt like a judgment. Beside him, the young woman instinctively knelt, her face a portrait of distress as she held her smartphone steady, the lens capturing every second of the assault. Blackwell stood over him, his muscular frame looming like a predator, fists still clenched, convinced he had finally asserted his dominance. He believed his status would shield him, that the low-status witnesses would remain silent out of fear. He was so consumed by his perceived victory that he didn't notice the security camera directly above or the fact that the world had changed in the time it took for Han to hit the floor. He had just committed an act of public violence in an era of zero tolerance, and the evidence was already circulating. Blackwell thought he had ended a nuisance. What he didn't know was that he had just signed his own death warrant in front of the entire city. The silence that followed the incident was deceptive, a heavy stillness that Adrian Blackwell mistook for his own victory. He spent the next few hours in his executive suite, washing the dust of the street from his hands and watching the legal teams scramble to suppress the viral footage. He felt untouchable, buffered by layers of corporate security and high-priced influence. However, as the sun began to set, casting long, crimson shadows across his office, His phone vibrated with a message that bypassed his encrypted filters. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons to an emergency board meeting at an undisclosed, high-security location, a place where the city's true power was brokered far from the public eye. Blackwell arrived at the windowless boardroom expecting to face his peers, his mind already rehearsing justifications about maintaining order and protecting the hospital's, or rather, the district's, reputation. He walked in with his chin held high, his muscular frame still radiating the controlled dominance that had served him for decades. But as he reached the far end of the long, obsidian table, the air in the room seemed to vanish. The high-backed leather chair at the head of the table swiveled slowly. There, seated in the position of ultimate authority, was the poor vendor. The transformation was absolute. Han Jae-Min was no longer wearing the dirty apron or the stained beige shirt. He was draped in a tailored charcoal suit that fit his thin frame with sharp, lethal elegance. His white hair was neatly combed, and his round glasses had been replaced by a gaze so cold and piercing it felt like a physical weight. Beside him stood the city's most influential power brokers, men Blackwell had spent years trying to impress, now standing in deferential silence. The atmosphere was suffocating, devoid of raised voices or dramatic accusations. On a massive screen behind Jae-Min, the footage of the push played on a continuous loop, the sound of the impact echoing louder in the quiet room than it had on the street. Blackwell's face drained of color as the realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave. This wasn't a vendor without influence. This wasn't someone who could be silenced by a legal team or a bulldozer. Jae-Min didn't move to strike him. He simply leaned forward into the light, his hands folded precisely on the table. He introduced himself not as the man Blackwell had humiliated, but as the owner of the very ground the CEO's empire was built upon. He spoke of policy, of equity, and of the death warrant Blackwell had signed the moment he decided that status was a license for abuse. In that moment, the hierarchy Blackwell worshipped was flipped upside down. He realized he wasn't looking at a victim, but at the king who held his entire future in his hands. The downfall of Adrian Blackwell was not a loud explosion, but a cold, systematic erasure. Within minutes of the meeting's end, the world he had built on a foundation of arrogance began to dissolve. Security personnel, the very men who had once hurried to open his doors, now stood as a wall between him and the life he knew. He was escorted from the building he once ruled, his polished black dress shoes clicking a hollow rhythm against the marble floors as he was led past the whispering interns and the administrators who no longer bothered to hide their disdain. The controlled dominance he had wielded like a weapon had been turned against him. He was no longer the architect of the city, but a liability to be purged. As he was led out onto the street, the same sun-drenched market where he had struck old Han felt like a different world. The death warrant he had signed was now being executed in the form of frozen assets, revoked licenses, and a reputation that was permanently altered. He watched, dazed, as his sleek black sedan was towed away, and his name was scrubbed from the digital displays of Blackwell International. He had believed that his status shielded him from the consequences of his cruelty, but he was forced to confront a truth that had long gone unspoken. That true power does not lie in a navy suit or a high-rise office, but in the respect one earns from those on the ground. At the edge of the square, the blue Noodle cart stood exactly where it always had, a symbol of professionalism under pressure. Han Jae-Min was there, having shed the charcoal suit to return to his worn-out beige shirt and stained apron. He didn't look triumphant or vindictive as he watched the fallen CEO. He remained steady and composed, accepting the quiet apologies of the bystanders with grace. Blackwell, standing on the pavement he had once tried to seize, finally looked at the vendor and saw the king he had been dealing with all along. He realized that Han hadn't been hiding behind a mask of poverty, but was living a life of dignity that Blackwell's billions could never buy. The market returned to its vibrant rhythm, the sound of the bulldozer replaced by the clinking of bowls and the low hum of conversation. The corner where the push had occurred became a reminder not of fear, but of a systemic change, a place where the quiet strength of knowing your worth had finally dismantled the hierarchy of a bully. Maya's lesson echoed through the streets. Justice doesn't happen in darkness. It begins when people refuse to shrink themselves to fit someone else's comfort. Han Jae-Min continued his work, a silent guardian of the city's character, proving that while kings may fall, the spirit of the street remains unshaken.